delighted and excited and honoured to be sitting down to have a conversation with Everjoice Win, currently the Director for Programmes and Global Engagement at ActionAid, but more importantly and more excitingly, recently appointed Professor of Practice at SOAS. EJ, as we know her, is also a board member of Just Associates. She's an activist whose reputation I was aware of even before I met her, and having met her, it was a very well-deserved reputation for being a trailblazer, fearless, and a warrior for not only women in Zimbabwe, but throughout Southern Africa, the continent, and the world. So Everjoice, welcome, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us in this conversation.
Thanks, Pontso, for that generous introduction. And it's nice to be chatting to you.
It's the least we could absolutely say about you. EJ, we just thought, given that we've got you and your wealth of experience, that given the times that the world is in, the issues that the world is facing, it would be really interesting to hear from you some thoughts that we're loosely going to call race and or race in development. So perhaps as a starter for 10, just sitting where you are, what's your sense of the conversation around events in the US, how they've played out globally around racial justice, and have they had any bearing on your work, either in internal conversations or ways people are behaving, both in your organisation and I guess just in a day-to-day sense?
The short answer is no.
So just interestingly, has there been any conversation, or as we'll take the first part first?
That's what I said. The short answer is no. Yeah. Right? Okay, let me expand on that. I'm saying largely no because, we all watched in absolute horror George Floyd being murdered on our TV screens, and shared and reshared that horrible, horrible image. I only watched it once and I couldn't bear to watch it again. And I think for many, many days after, just speaking for myself, I was just so immobilized, I think is the word. Yeah. Yes, having been born in Zimbabwe during the colonial days, having lived through racism in my last 2 years of high schooling, and even at university, because, we were the first sort of post-independence, second cohort of post-independence, university students, and we still had a lot of very racist professors. It shouldn't have come as a shock, but watching a human being being slaughtered like that on global television was just beyond what you could possibly describe and talk about. Yeah, how do you talk about somebody killing somebody in front of cameras? Having been raised in Southern Africa again, in the days when apartheid was still there in South Africa, and Namibia, right? So we were the last three. So again, the conversations around race are still alive in this part of the world. They have not stopped. And they don't stop being painful, right? So whether it's, again, in the context of South Africa, where I lived for more than 15 years, almost every month, seeing stories in the media about, some farmer shooting a child on a woman's back because he thought that that was a monkey, or, a black guy being dragged at the back of a truck because he had been, quote unquote, caught stealing by the farmer, right? We had those stories, on South African television, and they were still as shocking as what happened to Mr. Floyd, but still, yeah, I cannot describe it. And so what I'm saying is the conversations on race and racism in Southern Africa, which is where I'm located, have never stopped, right? They are ever present. They are part of our everyday lived experience, and our everyday struggles to this day. But of course, it's a different context, it's a different region, but the ties that bind both us as Black people across continents, but also the ties that bind the racists are the same, right? And so those conversations are there. But coming to my formal work and the world in which I work, which is the work of international development and feminist organizing, in my in my other life, right, half of my life, let me say, I think those are not conversations that we've been having as loudly as we should be been having them. I certainly do not remember in the 16 years that I have been in this particular organization a very direct and concrete conversation in those 16 years. We've talked about power, right? We've talked about the different forms of negative power, right? And I will come to that later. But in this immediate moment as well, I think the word that comes to mind again is the same one, immobilized, right? I think, yes, we know we are being called upon and the moment demands conversation, but I think, yeah, we are like deer caught in the headlights. We're like, just,
yeah,
what do we do now?
yeah.
Because I think in our arsenal of tools, we don't have the tools, right?
Can I just ask, EJ, just when you say we, are you talking about as a kind of, a profile of organizations?
Yeah. So, and let me say why I'm centering myself, right? Because I work in an international NGO, but I also don't just work. I am in a very senior position. So I am saying we because I am not, I don't want to say they, because who's they? I'm part of it. I occupy a particularly senior role, right, in this organization, and so that's why I'm doing that.
I mean, it's interesting you saying that because where I've sat has predominantly been in the UK. So being involved in international development, sitting in the UK as also a Southern African. And, a lot of the conversation probably over the last 2 years has been about this whole issue about how race is situated almost in the conception of what the priorities are, who decides, whose voice, whose narrative. And I just wonder, sort of again, thinking about what you've just said about where you sit in the organization, in your experience, how do race issues present in development from where you're sitting?
So let me start with the first problematic, right? As international NGOs, we see our role as doing development, whether it's human rights based or, the other things we layer onto it. But we see our role as doing development over there, right? So development is about solving problems that face those people.
Yeah.
In Africa, in Asia, in the Americas, south of Mexico, right? So it's not about us as human beings in solidarity with other human beings. And I will talk about that in the context of COVID. Yes, we use that word solidarity, but the biggest way in which we express solidarity, and we know how, is by giving money to those people there, right? And then using that money to do good over there. Yeah? And so to that extent, it's not about us and how we are interacting with, supporting, joining hands with, being part of the same set of systems, right? Whether it's patriarchy or colonialism or racism or fundamentalisms. No. There is us over here, and then there is those people that are affected by those problems. And our role is to help those people. So to that extent, the only time that race then comes into the conversation might be, I don't know. I'm trying to think. When would it have then been a conversation?
I mean, one example for, that again, and I say this sitting here, is that in the wake of George Floyd's murder, a number of UK development organisations came out or put out statements which were very much centred around, and I will paraphrase some of the words, we have a commitment to racial justice. And I guess part of what went through my head was, well, why now? Why all of a sudden? When, the very model by which, to use your example, you are doing to others over there, that relationship was fundamentally based on race. It's almost the concept of, the UK or the US or Sweden or France or wherever it is, sort of seeing the other and suddenly deciding that it's important at this particular moment to make a public statement about a commitment to something which almost seems like it came to them overnight, rather than was built into the basic fundamentals of how they're structured to do what they do, where they do it, i.e. over there with the others.
So that's it, isn't it? I think we shouldn't be dishonest about it, right? It may have subliminally been there in our heads somewhere. But it really wasn't a conversation. It wasn't even a word. Read our strategies. Well, I can comfortably talk about ours because I was involved in at least 3 of them, right? I was involved in the writing of the one in 2006, Rights to End Poverty. That was its name. I was involved in the next one in 2010, whose title I always forget and I do not know why. Seriously, it's like I have a mind block. And then the current one, which I was the main person in charge of a 14-person team that wrote Action for Global Justice. Let me go and do a word search, but I don't remember it.
Interesting.
No, really, I don't.
Interesting.
I don't even remember us having a heated conversation in the development of the strategy, and it was a year-long process. We are very known for our processes, and it took an entire year, right? From January to December. It was finally adopted in December 2016.
Yeah.
I do not remember a word, but I do remember. So let me tell you what I remember. I remember a big fight in 2010. People's Action Against Poverty. That's the second one, whose title I was forgetting, the 2010.
Well remembered.
When we were doing the development of that, I remember a conversation, a very heated one, right? Where literally a number of my colleagues on the team, I can't remember how many we were, getting upset about the references to the global north and the global south. Like, we should get over this phraseology. It is not helpful. That's a thing of the past. If we want to be closer to movements and we want to be closer to the people, and we are all fighting against the same forces, we shouldn't. Yeah, and I remember, some very seriously senior women in particular. One in particular, who is in a very senior position in another NGO in Europe now, getting really, really worked up. And I remember her saying, when she left, I can't remember what conversation we were having sort of randomly after I met her, after she left. She's like, I'm so happy now. I don't have to keep talking about North and South.
And they're based in the North?
Oh, yes.
Interesting. Because
they found it seriously problematic. So that is the conversation I remember.
Yeah, okay.
Do you not remember the conversation on race?
Yeah.
But there is something else that I wanted to say to you earlier before I forget that point.
Yes, go ahead.
When I was talking about, the problematic is that INGOs are built to do development work over there, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I think there is a second layer to it. And this is something that, I wrote about many, many years ago, and many people who do gender and development always tell me that they read this article that I wrote, the one called Not Poor, Powerless and Pregnant, right? In which I was saying development is not about people like me, right? And how I feel about issues or I see issues is sort of not important. It is not part of the conversation. Of course, I'm not, I'm very highly privileged. I'm educated. I am middle class. I speak English, right? And I'm now an older woman. So add all of those layers of privilege into my life, right? But I think the problematic I want to bring out is our colleagues from the global north often forget that when I am talking about the community, right?
Yes.
In Zimbabwe, these are not some theoretical, academic, conceptual group of human beings. These are my relatives, right?
Amen. Yes.
We're going to go to my village, right? To do development. And I might then stay overnight, right? With my or my uncles or, whoever they are. And I go to that community almost every Christmas, right? Or that community comes to me at Christmas,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Yeah.
So intimate connection that these are my people.
Yes.
These are, right? Is often forgotten.
Yeah.
But it's not even part of the conversation, right? So I'm sure my colleagues would be shocked. When I say that, they'll be like, really? You? And I do remember, one of my colleagues back then, he was from India, when I said, we were talking about access to, antiretrovirals. And I said, my sister can't afford antiretrovirals. She's very poor. The guy looked at me and he goes, if she's your sister, she's not poor. And I'm good.
Gosh. Yeah.
The connection, because she's related to me.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But how many me's are there in that whole extended family that you are thinking, because she happens to be my sister, yes, I'm getting a decent salary, but how many sisters of these do I have? And how many me's are there in this family? And you're forgetting that there is a whole dynamic, and there's a history which is gendered, raced, and colonial, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
So, that's one of the things again. So development was founded on this notion of we're doing work over there, but it was about in its early stages, about those people from the north coming to the south.
Yes.
Then here we are, Southerners like me are sitting in this space. So who are we and what are we? We straddle these two worlds. I can be, as I often laugh and say, I can be in this, virtual conversation at 9:00 in the morning and speaking to, people in Australia and in Bangkok and in Joburg. And by 4:00 the same day, I am in a funeral in the community, right?
Yes. Yeah.
The same day, not even the next day.
Yeah.
That's not even part of the conversation.
But it's the reality of it, because I know sort of an expression that I hear time and time again here is this notion of lived experience. And it seems that those who are doing the arbitration around what kind of lived experience are not the folks who, are doing the living, as it were. So it's,
exactly.
If, as you say, because you are working in this, in the context in which you're working, just who decides whether or not, or is it anybody else's role to decide what your lived experience actually is? And I think that is an ongoing thing. And it does make me wonder when, as individuals who can speak our minds and have access to spaces where somehow in some contexts our experience is negated because it doesn't fit the narrative that serves this kind of charitable context. And I think that's an interesting one. But I'm thinking, Everjoice, what you were saying about sort of organizations, development organizations, NGOs working in solidarity with movements, and I just wonder sort of if we can sort of touch back on that one, because I think when we think of history and some of the big changes for Black people across the world, a lot of that change, that positive change, has come about because of the work of social movements. And sort of, again, thinking about, this conversation around race at the moment and racial justice movements, but also thinking of your experience with the women's rights and feminist movement, do you think traditional NGOs can meaningfully engage with social movements, work in solidarity with social movements? And if yes, are there areas particularly around race that might pose challenges for meaningful solidarity and engagement by NGOs with the more kind of racial justice social movements?
Well, again, the short answer is yes, right? Lots of amazing potential. However, and that's where we need to start, it requires a much deeper, more meaningful engagement and understanding of a different way of working, a different way of relating, a different way of seeing and behaving. So let me give you an example. And I want to use COVID because it's what's in front of us right now. So going back to what I was saying about, development has tended to be about us over there, us over here going to over there, right? So enter COVID, March 2020, right? Where does it strike? Italy, the UK, Spain. I'm naming those three because those are three of the largest countries where my organization works and where it also gets a lot of its resources, particularly the first two, Italy and the UK, right? So for the, March, April, May, I think for the whole 3 months, what did we do? I think we largely just simply sat there and looked at these three countries and were like, oh dear, oh, how terrible. Other than sending emails to, my friend Beatrice in Italy, my colleague Marco, Luca, having a private conversation with Anna in Spain, being in solidarity with my friend Lee in London and, saying, how are you? How are you coping with homeschooling? The colleagues in my team, Ruchi, David, who sit in London. As an INGO, we did not know how to behave because now the pyramid is inverted. What do you do? What could we have done? I'm not blaming anybody for this. I'm saying, do you see what I'm saying? The problematic of the structural foundations of the INGO world meant we just sat there and watched Italy happen.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And all we could do was to send messages.
Yep.
That's the challenge, right?
Yeah. Yes.
We don't know other ways of being and doing and acting. So if we are serious about working with movements, it challenges everything we are. Right? Our very being is it should lead us to questioning a lot of the ways in which we work. And again, I'm not saying, we are horrible people, who are colonialist, and we mean well. We do, well. We want to be in solidarity. We want to, be at the heart of social change and social justice, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it challenges a lot of our ways of seeing and being and acting. And so we would have to change that. But I think also equally, and again, it's not a one-way street because I also came from, the other side, from the women's movement.
Yes.
I think it is also incumbent upon the movements to also understand what are some of the ways of our being and acting and behaving that have also helped to make change happen.
Yes.
Right?
Yep. Yep.
Problematic as it may be, right? Why some of us are still here 16 years later, right? I always say this is the longest consensual relationship I've ever had in my life. Because I saw the possibility, not only so, but I experienced the real change that a big INGO with resources, with power, with visibility, with access to power, right? What it can do compared to my small little, wonderfully, feminist movement, but we were just so limited. And yet here was this bigger platform where the conversation wasn't happening about women's rights. And so I came into the space and I stayed because I could see the possibility and I could work with others to make that change happen. So what I'm saying is I think it's also for the movement to also see what are the good sides of international NGOs, right?
Yeah.
What is it that they are able to do? And what is it that they have been able to do? The reach, the scale, it can only be better by
the sum of the parts being greater than the whole. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting one because, sort of thinking about, I hear in my head, when we're thinking about racial justice at the moment and just thinking, how do you bring together, the traditional northern white top-down organizations that are kind of, built in a way that is about the North leading. There's consultation, there's engagement, there are all those kind of best practices, but where the bulk of the staff are from the UK, let's use this example, who are seen as and set up as experts in contexts where, I often think, do they speak the language? Do they eat the food? Do they walk the roads? Do they really get it? And I think that's an interesting one where you're bringing racial justice social movements together with a system that was created, in a way that perhaps is slightly less comfortable with having those conversations that are necessary for that solidarity to be able to happen. We can hope.
But look, again, let me mention something that at least we've done in ActionAid, right? Which could be the building block and the opening towards the conversation on racial justice, right? So we've had a lot of conversations on power. Lots.
Yes.
Inside our own organization, right? In 2015, particularly, we commissioned Taka Awori from Ghana, who is a former ActionAider, to do a piece of work that analyzed from our lived experiences, people inside the organization, what were the power dynamics in the organization, and what were the sources of unequal power, and how could this be addressed, right? So again, I come back to what I was saying earlier. So we had the conversation. Yeah. But it's not to say, of course, having it once means, you're solving the problem. But what I'm trying to bring to the table is we've had the conversation. And so a conversation, not the A, because it's if I the, then it's like the be all and end, a conversation, which potentially sets us up for another step up, right, in the conversation. Because as I said to you, I don't remember a time where the word race was even on the table, right? But gender, yes. North, south, yes. Inequality, mostly in terms of income, right? Yes. Injustice, yes, right? So we've got the words, we've got the concepts, we've got our hearts in the right place, and we've gotten to a place. We got to a place, but maybe two steps up the ladder, but on a particular rung that gets us to a good space to have the conversation. But let me also then quickly say, I do feel that in terms of the various forms of power that we were, even that conversation about power, it was a very difficult conversation, right? It was a very difficult conversation.
You mean for the individuals involved in it?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Largely involving international directors and country directors, because in our model, the leaders of the various country entities are quite powerful in terms of, the fact that they make decisions in their geographic space. And then we have the assembly that makes decisions. So a Malawi, for instance, is a member. It has the same 2 votes as Italy, right? Never mind that they get money from Italy, but they do have 2 seats in the assembly, right? Mm-hmm. What that is worth. And it is a lot, right? So we had that conversation. It was a very uncomfortable conversation because, like all conversations about power and privilege, once you open up the space and you open up the conversation, it will lead to tears. There will be tears, right?
Yeah.
In more on one side than on the other, and it should be. But I think what then happened in that particular moment, let me say, it was so uncomfortable and so painful that I don't think we were prepared, right? For, what my friends in jazz call a container. So we did not have the container, right? To contain anger, the pain, the fallout that came out of it. And so unfortunately, because of that pain and that anger that it unleashed, and because we had not prepared ourselves for it, we once again immobilized ourselves, right? And coming back to the question on the table, which is about racial justice, I think that's where we are right now, right? So, you had asked me, are we having conversation? I had said no. And part of the reason we haven't really had a meaningful conversation is this. So I have been very loud, in the leadership team to say, if we're going to open up this conversation, it's not going to be a webinar with, I don't know, the SG or the leadership team saying some nice words, right?
Yeah.
It's not going to come through sending a questionnaire around and doing a staff survey. It's not going to be a workshop on diversity. This is not about diversity, our favorite word, right? Especially in the UK.
Yes.
It's something, it's a conversation that, again, we really haven't got the tools, but that doesn't mean the tools don't exist.
Yes.
And where we can ask the ones with the tools, the movements, the Black Lives Matter movements, the people who've been having the conversation and who know how to create the necessary containers for the conversation, to say, listen, could you help us here, right? So that's what I've been saying. I've been saying, just don't do a knee-jerky thing. Don't rush statements. Don't rush with the webinar. Don't rush with we're not, prepare the groundwork, right? But of course, I know the implication then is we are dragging our feet, we're not doing anything, we're not speaking out, and that's, you know, a practical problem we're gonna live with. So, you know, and maybe I'm being overcautious. I'm just feeling like I don't want to see that conversation going the same way that the power conversation went.
Can you avoid that happening? Because given this is so fundamental to who the organizations are, the individuals, the institution itself, and given that this isn't just about what's happened over the last year, it's actually about the very system whereby money is coming from certain geographies going to others, and without having that conversation and really going through that. I think I read a book by Edgar Villanova about decolonizing philanthropy, which almost talks about the process of, you know, recognizing, understanding, grieving, you know, and then, you know, going through the bereavement process, coming through to the point where there is understanding. Because you can't, just as you say, you can't go, well, we've put out our statement, therefore we are no longer X. It is about that really hard work, which is, you know, because it's individuals in institutions, both those levels, having to really explore what and who they are.
That's why I'm saying what I'm saying is I don't want the conversation to go the way the power conversation I was referring to earlier, in that the power conversation then didn't go anywhere, right?
Yeah.
Because once the tears came and the anger came, we didn't know how to
process that.
We didn't know how to navigate that, right? And work with it. Not to say stop the tears, you know, just wade through the tears, swim through them, you know, whatever was required, and come out the other side and still continue the conversations. So it needs a lot of thinking through, it needs a lot of preparation, it needs, deep thought.
Yes. And to a certain extent, sort of bravery, because it is very, very hard.
Yeah.
You know, so, you know, credit to you for thinking about not only how do we do this, but how do we do it in a responsible way that can, you know, prevent what you call that kind of immobility, which becomes all consuming.
And I also have another, you know, concern at the back of my head, because of this propensity by our sector to behave in certain ways. So look at the whole conversation around safeguarding, right? What we did as a sector, right? The sewage burst onto the into
the river.
Square, right? As I often say, it burst into the town square, right? Now, instead of looking at it, like really looking at it, going, okay, this is what it is. It's really ugly. It's really awful, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What is the first thing we did? Hire safeguarding people and create a safeguarding team and train everybody in safeguarding and come up with safeguarding policies. Great. Wonderful. Mm-hmm. But as my sisters in jazz would also remind you, that is only the one part of the triangle of what you need, right?
Yeah.
That's only the visible stuff. So great, we got the visible stuff now. We got the tick boxes now. We know which box to tick, right? Tick, tick, tick. We got the people, we did the training, we have the manual, we have the policy, right?
Yes.
But what is happening with the system and the organizational architecture that has to take this policy now and translate it into reality. Use it in the so-called field, right?
Yeah.
And be interacting with rights holders and be interacting with each other in the organization, right? Before you even go into the community. And then what's happened to the culture, right? The values, the norms, the beliefs, because those are still there. And we're not talking about it, right? So I have seen the latest donor requirements for grants. You know, you have a tick box on safeguarding.
And you tick it, and then?
There's no box to tick on the values and the norms and the beliefs, is there? There is
Exactly.
a box to tick on the policy, but there is no box to tick on the mindset, right?
Yeah.
And the behavior stuff.
Yes.
Well, not as big a box anyway, if it does exist. And so that's where my fear is of the race conversation going in exactly the same direction. Because that's where I'm saying we need to change our way of seeing, the way of doing, the way of being.
Yes.
Only way we know how is to do exactly what we did with safeguarding.
Yeah.
Which is only deal with what we can see and what we can put on paper, but not have the uncomfortable conversation.
Yeah. No. So EJ, give us some hope, because that was big, and I absolutely hear you, but it's just trying to think, you know, I mean, you spoke about not wanting to rush to issue statements, talking about we, you know, are committed to X or Y. You talked about, you know, recognizing the difficult conversations that are needed. But it's almost like if you had to say from your experience, what's the one most useful piece of advice you could give to an organization that is now kind of thinking we need to do something, what would that advice be?
So when we had the conversation in our leadership team, you know what I said? I said, if you're going to do anything, send people a blank piece of A4 paper and say, and just mark it race in ActionAid and send it around. Here's a blank piece of paper. Say what you want to say. That's what I want, a blank piece of paper. Because if you send me the questionnaire, I'm going to start questioning the questions.
I can imagine you doing exactly that.
First of all, who's going to set the questions? And what will they say? Do you know what I mean? Like, who's going to set the question?
Yep.
Even that is important. What are you asking? And what is making you choose those particular questions?
Yes, absolutely.
Those may not be the questions. Those may not be the most important questions of the moment, right? Mm-hmm. But also they may not even talk to the experience, right? So start with a blank piece of paper. Start with the conversation, hearing from the people who live and experience it, right? What has been their experience? That's the first thing. Because within that, you will then get to hear the big stuff and some of the smallest stuff that you probably had never thought was significant.
So
right?
Just to say, so we know some of the big stuff, but when you say some of the little stuff, what might be some of those little things that you kind of think these are also manifestations of this in, you know, happening in organizations?
So I will give you a series of examples of those.
Uh-huh.
Do you know how many minutes it takes my white colleague to get a response to an email versus how many days it takes me to get a response to an email?
So are you colleagues on, seniority
We are
or?
on the same level.
Okay. And so you're on the same level. The difference between you is that, I mean, I know who
He's
you are.
white. He's
Okay.
white.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm going to guess that your response time is slightly longer.
Slightly. Now that would be the understatement of the century. So let me be specific. We counted it over many days with some of my feminist sisters in the organization. 10 minutes is what it took for her to get a response. 10 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, like her email fell.
And already?
I might get a response in 5 days or 10 or maybe never.
Wow.
Right? It's from both Black and white people. So that's important to mention. So when I'm talking race and how I've experienced it in my setting, it is not just about me in relation to white people or vice versa. It's also about me as a Black woman, right?
Yes.
And how my gender and certainly my race plays a role in how I relate or some of the relationships, right? So that's one example. In fact, long before, what I also used to do is sometimes if I want something responded to, I would ask her, my white colleague, to send out the email.
So you're
right?
already finding ways to navigate around.
Yeah, because she's going to get a response and I'm not. And what I want is a response. So fine, right?
Yeah. Wow. Wow. And that's
one example.
Yeah. And
second example.
Uh-huh.
I am leading the strategy development process, the one I told you about in 2016.
Yes.
On the very same team, right? Mm-hmm. A member of my team is sitting in the meeting. You hear me? They do not tell me the problem that they have either with the process or with the content of what we are generating. Uh-huh. But the minute they get out of the meeting, or even while they are still in the meeting, they are upping my white boss, complaining about the process and all the content. Live in the
very meeting.
Right? So he's now forwarding them. Thank goodness we had a good relationship and he knew where he stood with me, my boss, my boss. So he would then be forwarding these things to me in real time. But the fella is right there.
And for whatever reason, has taken a decision to go a different route instead of coming direct. Yeah.
You are here.
Yeah.
This is a collective process. You have a problem? Say it. Yeah. You don't agree with whatever we're coming up with? Say it. Yeah. Why are you going now? Via. Over there. Like, so the message that I get, whatever your reasons are, but the message I get is, this girl of yours who's sitting in this meeting and is in charge, I do not like what she is doing. So I am coming to you because you are the more reasonable human being. Because remember, it's not about what you intend, it's about the impact of what you are doing.
Yes, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So you can then claim all sorts of things. I never intended to disrespect you. No, it wasn't like that. So what was it like? Yeah. What was it about me that made you feel that I could not respond to your problem? Right?
As you say, there's so many potential different layers there. But these are the realities in which, in which you're existing, doing your job. So you're not just focused on getting the job done, but there's all these microaggressions, these macroaggressions, and these systemic, sort of challenges to just being you and your best in the role that you're doing.
Third example, and I'll that one. There are many more.
I can imagine.
I am visiting African country X, and I'm supposed to be in a meeting with the country director, right? So in our structure, country directors are autonomous. Country directors are the primary leaders of our units, the largest, the first units of our operation are the countries. So in our structure, countries have power, and country directors are the most senior people in that structure. Of course, they have their boards, but in terms of the management, again, they are the top layer, right? So I'm sitting there and I'm waiting, and in her little annex, and she's not coming out. So eventually, I peep my head through, and she's agitated on the phone, and she's like, yeah, but I told you we were busy. We had these workshops to do in the community, and this is why, we are late in sending you the revised figures. But I told you we are going to do it. No, you don't have to shout at me like this. So eventually she comes off this call. She's really distraught and she's upset. And I'm like, who are you talking to? She gives me the name. And I said, from where? She mentions the name of the northern country. I don't know this person. Not that I know all 3,000 people who work for the claim, but I know all of the senior managers, right? So I know the country directors who are her equivalent, right? She's a country director. I'm assuming she was talking to the country director of the affiliate, right? Yeah. The funding member. And she's like, no, I think she's a project officer, or maybe she has an important position, but I can't quite remember. So I say, let's go to the, address list.
Yes.
So we look up the address list, the whole list of people in the organization. And we find this is a very, very junior person in that particular country structure.
Yes.
Right? Wow. Been sitting there and telling off a whole country director, right? Of another member of ActionAid.
Yes.
Now, I'm sorry. What gives this young person the gumption, this junior person, I don't know, they were young, this junior person, the gumption to call the director of an entity that is independent of her own entity and feel that she can say this? Right? So when I shared this story on a visit to another country, they were so upset with me. They're like, you're so hierarchical, you're all about position. I said, no, you're missing the point. Here is my question to you. Can you imagine a scenario where a project officer, not even a project officer, the head of finance from that particular country, phoning your country director here, not the head of finance, your country director here, and telling her off? They're like, of course it can happen. Why not? I'm like, please, can we just be realistic for 2 seconds? Right? Yeah. So, those are the things that I'm picking up those are some of the experiences, right?
Yeah.
And which, of course, get explained away, get rationalized, get brushed off, you know. But those are some of the everyday realities, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's not in the manual, it's not going to be in the strategy, it's not going to be in the policies. It's those things that you feel and experience and live and touch and go home and cry, right?
Yes, yeah.
Which we need to talk about. Particularly, you see, in this context where the racism is not going to be so blatant. So that's the other thing, right? To say, if you're going to look for it staring at you from the other side of the table and announcing itself, you're not going to find it, right? And also, certainly, which is why, if you were then to confront somebody and say, but you were racist, me, I believe in human rights. I've been fighting for social justice all my life. This is why I work for this organization. Ask all my colleagues, you know, I lived in Nepal and I moved to, you know, Cambodia and I have lived in Ethiopia and, you know, my wife is from Zambia. How can you?
Yes.
Racism. And my child even has a Zimbabwean name. Okay. So that's, and I think that's also the challenge, right? To say, coming back to your question about give us some hope. If people are going to be trying to do this work and have these conversations, don't go looking for the obvious. Don't go looking for the visible, because you're not going to find it. Right? Particularly in organizations like ours, who have set themselves a very high standard, but also who have tended to be very progressive, right? And I don't take that away from, you know, from our organizations, who have been very progressive more than most.
Yes, yeah.
It is much harder in those settings, right? And the conversations will be even much more painful in those conversations, because we have tended to believe and wanted to believe that we are all good people, right? And this is a good organization, and we are all human rights based, right? So the conversations will be much, much more difficult, and the racism will be much, much harder to unearth.
Yes.
Because it's those little things, it's those 10-minute emails.
Yes.
That are insignificant, but they are very significant because they add up.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And there's something about, you know, as my own experience in different organizations, it's having to suck up those microaggressions, which are wounding to the self.
Yeah.
Because you don't, at certain points, want to upset the status quo or something. So the expectation that the discomfort and the pain is carried only by one group of people, rather than everyone having the conversation around it to try and prevent it happening to anybody. And I think, you know, I take from you this, you know, the sense that it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be obvious. But it is important that it happens.
So the hope is create the space.
Yes.
Give people the blank sheet of paper. Don't try and control the conversation, because you can't. if you're going to open up the conversation, make sure that you have a container large enough to hold the pain, the grief, the anger, right? Because this can break organization. It will, right? Make sure you're ready for it so that you have the tools to be able to manage the conversation. Make sure you're not just focusing on the policies and on the pieces of paper and on hiring staff and putting it in the pigeonhole of diversity, because it's not going to fit into that pigeonhole, right? And for heaven's sake, if you are not of the right disposition, then don't even lead the conversation. Don't even try and lead the conversation. No.
Stay away.
Yeah.
More
importantly, make sure you are creating the necessary amount of time. This is not going to be one of those nice, quick, to-dos that you can then tick and be like, we're going to put it in the annual report. It's going to take months. It might take even years. So be prepared for the long haul. So again, I'm saying the tools that we normally have as INGOs, the time frames that we normally allocate to processes, the way we watch the clock. Well, as one old man once said to me in a particular village in Zim, we have been poor for so many centuries. Where are you in a hurry to go? Why are you in a hurry? If you are in a hurry, you can go back. We will still be here when you come back. So next time when you come, make sure you've set aside enough time to talk to us, but don't be watching your clock, because we've been poor for so many years. So we're not in a hurry.
I think that so well sums it up.
Yeah.
Slightly depressingly, but just really does sum it up. These are issues of justice. They don't happen overnight. So, yeah. So, EJ, I don't know, you've been really generous with yourself and your time, but, just want to see before we close, is there anything else that you want to share?
Yeah, I've been talking about INGOs. I think the last bit I just want to talk about is in the feminist movement, right? Because that's another space where I think we are not having enough of these conversations, if any, right? Again, because, sisterhood, solidarity, and we have tended to overlook certain things, either because they are uncomfortable or because it would just be too painful, right? But I think there is never a perfect moment to have these conversations, and this is a good time as any. And I think it's important that we have them. We do the calling out, but I think more importantly, as the phraseology goes, we're calling each other in, right? After the calling out, we need to call each other in, because we all know that it's festering, it's down there, and we are not immune to what's happening around us. We can't be, right? So I just want to tell one story because I think it is an important story.
They're all important
I have
teachers.
stories for days.
Absolutely.
Early 90s, long time ago. We are in the US. We were in Washington, D.C. For one conference or the other. And back to back with that conference was going to be the awarding of the Reebok Human Rights Awards. And one of the recipients of that award was Radhika Kumaraswamy from Sri Lanka, well-known human rights lawyer. She was going to get an award for her work. And one feminist sister, who shall remain unnamed, who is from the US, for a reason that I am still baffled by to this day, invites me to her house. Just me, and there were many of us. There were quite a few of us from WILDAF. I was there as part of, Women, Law and Development in Africa. So there were many of us, and we had come as part of, the group of organizations that were working around violence against women towards Vienna, towards Beijing, right? And so this woman invites me to her house. I don't know why she invited me. Maybe because I was like the youngest of the lot and she thought she could rant in my presence, which is what she basically spent the 2 hours that I spent with her doing. And she says, and I tell this story because it's such an important story. And why she's upset and what she has basically invited me to come and rant about Radhika is that she had not been invited to the award ceremony, right? Neither by Radhika nor by Reebok. And then she says, so she's walking up and down. It was actually quite a scary situation. And by this time she's drunk a whole bottle of wine by herself because I don't.
Gosh.
And so she's walking up and down in a very neat apartment. And then she says, these people, how can they invite Radhika? How can they be giving an award to Radhika and they don't invite me? Me! Do they know who I am? They don't understand. I am the person who discovered Radhika. I found that woman. I discovered her in the jungles of Sri Lanka. I swear.
Ouch.
I remember these words like it was yesterday. And I met Radhika only once, so I've never actually met her to tell her this story. So you'll probably see it on this podcast.
Wow.
And then she gets so angry, and then she takes her glass and she smashes it against her kitchen wall. And at that point, I decide, okay, maybe I think I should leave now. I was quite young. I was very
for your own safety.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm sorry that you're upset, but I'm sure she will come visit you. This is a story about one particular individual. But what's interesting about that story is, which I then discovered, right? Because I then decide, why is she behaving like this, and what's at the root of this? Then I discovered that there was an ongoing conversation amongst this sort of cohort of senior women, senior feminists, right, in the US, Canada, I suppose, about who owns who from the global south, right? So there was a fight about, so if you were seen with her, you couldn't then be seen with the other person, right? And if the other group invited you to their thing, then those other people in that other thing wouldn't invite you. So we were the points of interest, right? Among these white sisters. And so we were pigeonholed. We were owned by one or the other of them. And then I suppose in later life, I got owned by Lisa Venaklasa. And so it's, yeah. Right?
So did you, in those, I was going to say relationships, I'm not sure that would be how to describe them, but you had no agency at all. You were adopted.
No. Yes.
Got it.
right? And I would be chaperoned, and we would be presented at the right opportunities.
Trotted out.
Yeah, when it's yeah, right. Let's just sit with that, right?
Yes.
The meaning of it.
Yes.
And I have seen shades of it, right? The older I get, you can then see shades of it. You can see some remnants of it, and in those relationships, in how people talk to you, or invite you to this thing or the other thing, or not invite you, or include you or exclude you, and we need to have those conversations. Basically, is what I'm saying. Because we are not immune to what's happening around us. We are part and parcel of our own societies. We are products of these societies and the isms that are all out there. And simply because we are feminists, that doesn't mean that we are, perfect.
Absolutely.
And we still need the same amount of time, the same containers, the same approaches to actually having the conversation.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing, and I think, when I think of solidarity, is understanding who your comrades are within the movement. Because I think while there are difficult conversations to be had, I think there are also some really, really important relationships to be celebrated. Absolutely. Yep. And I think for me, that's why I really, really was so excited that you were able to talk to us, because I know that you are, as an individual, someone who sort of, not to homogenize an entire movement of a continent, but, particularly as a Southern African, I look to you very much as a sister and a comrade, but most importantly as a friend. So I just absolutely want to say thank you so much for taking the time. A pleasure as always, and we'll have a more informal conversation through other channels, I'm sure.
Yes.
But just to say, stay safe and well. Do you, as they say.
You too, my darlings. You too, my darling.